So, all right, let's make a formal introduction for our listeners. Good afternoon, Steve. My name is Claudia. I'm calling you from Washington, D.C., from the Student Fairfax City. We're very humble and grateful that Steve Roach accepted our invitation to our show. Steve, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you so much. Glad to meet you and to be part of your legacy of your show that's building here.
Thank you very much, man. Let's go back to the beginning in your life, Steve. Were you born like in a musical family? I mean, how old were you when you perhaps began taking, guitar lesson or piano lesson way before the keyboards?
Right. So I'm an only child, and I was born in San Diego, California. And my father came out of the military and went directly to work at a missile factory, essentially, in the early days of building missiles that helped put man on the moon. And eventually that turned into defense missiles and that sort of thing. So he was a working class family that I was born into and grew up in as an only child. And there was no musicians, no brothers and sisters, no real pathway towards that kind of creative life. But what was really influential early on from growing up in San Diego was that the desert and mountains and ocean were all together there in one day. I could visit all of that in one day. So that kind of connection to the natural world had a big influence on me as a young person. And ultimately, there was feelings that would be activated especially in the desert, that expansiveness, the deep quiet that I was already resonating with as a youngster and as a young guy with a creative mind already. It was very, very much desiring the kind of spaces that you get to through more refined, let's say, soundscapes. So, the desert environment, the sounds of the desert, that sort of thing. So that was really, I always attribute my first sonic influences as that bridge between silence and sound and this kind of inner place that gets activated when you're in these more solitary and refined natural environments.
Perfect, man. I think when you were, I don't know, in high school or you were 15, 16, what kind of music were you listening? Were you buying vinyl? I mean, music was part of your life back
Yeah, absolutely. Early memory would be, early Donovan and early the Seeds and the early kind of pop and psychedelic music being the age that I, am now at 68 years old, but coming up through like the late 60s, and you had the whole sort of confluence of the 60s music and hippie culture, which I wasn't really connected to, but the music and the influence of the psychedelic culture that was coming through the music, early Pink Floyd, absolutely there. And quite quickly, I was hungering for this music that had some kind of, and I couldn't really explain it directly at that time, but I was drawn towards music that gave me the feeling that I was getting, as I just expressed about, in these natural environments. So I started hearing the progressive music of the day, especially the music of Yes. And so at the beginning of Yes album, like Close to the Edge, for example, there's that soundscape in the beginning, and I wanted that space to go on for an hour. That sounded like a symphony, of a natural symphony that was tuning and warming up, and I just really wanted to be immersed in that kind of place. And the same within Pink Floyd's early soundscape music I was more interested in the pieces that moved away from traditional blues or rock or that kind of formation of songs, but more into soundscape music. Early on, I was always craving and looking for that direction.
And your parents, so well, this kid really like music, is buying vinyl before you bought your first keyboard. Were any pressure to kind of go to school and forget about music? Your parents telling you, forget about this hobby, but you're not going to make any money, in the music world, or you have freedom to explore whatever you wanted to do in your life?
No, that's a great relevant question. And I mean, early on, we're happy that I was listening to music, holed up in my bedroom alone. That was like they could keep an eye on there a lot easier,
Of course, yeah.
So but and they, again, coming from working class, I mean, there wasn't this big push to go to college. It was more like, you got to, it's time to look for a job or decide what you're going to do. And so I was kind of left to my own devices to figure out and find my way. My mom was really very much supportive as in terms of me following this instinct of being an artist. She could see I had this artist feeling and this vision in me, and I was doing some painting early on and was really creative with my hands, building things. So she was supporting that kind of natural, but really not really, there was no real direction or focus on it at that point. But
Yeah.
eventually, the love of music landed me a job in a local independent small record store that was, of course, it was all about vinyl. And so my first record that I ever owned, it would have been the White Album or Sgt. Pepper's and Magical Mystery Tour. But the album that really lit me up was the first album by the band Spirit.
Yeah.
That first, the California psychedelic band Spirit, that there was aspects of that music I'm still haunted by, like some of the string arrangements by Lou Adler on there. And there was just an atmosphere to that was very evoking of these kind of spaces that exist in between worlds. I like to say there's like these feelings of perception you cannot put words to easily or at all. So that's where a lot of music would start to illuminate these feelings that we all have as human beings. If we some folks tune into it really early on or at some point, and then any kind of all types of genres of music can live in those in between worlds or in those vast genres that became so popular when music was especially nurtured through the natural, intuitive, creative instincts rather than boardroom meetings like now, where they construct music really specific for an audience and that sort of thing. Where, we grew up and for at this point when music was really coming from on the most part a really pure and an evolutionary state of development through all sorts of things that were happening within the culture at our age. And at that time, where there was a lot of experimentation on a lot of levels, whether it be, drug experimentation or meditation or immersive states from nature, all of that stuff was there and available, especially in Southern California, where you have idyllic weather and you have incredible, like I say, landscapes. Where one day I would wake up in the desert, have lunch in the mountains, and then watch the sunset at the ocean, all in one day, but all with a soundtrack that would be, in my vehicle mapped out for that journey. I would have early Vangelis or Pink Floyd or Tangerine Dream, that whole menu of music that would allow your imagination to really soar. And this was all before I was creating music myself. I was working in the record store, and I was getting imports coming in every week from Gem Records in Southern California. They were the big importer on the West Coast that would bring in everything on vinyl, the early material, No Pussyfooting, early Tangerine Dream, all the early Klaus Schulze, all the Steve Hillage, all the great electronic stuff that was coming out of Europe and the UK and Italy and all over the world, essentially. So we would crack these boxes open every Friday or Saturday, and it was just mind-blowing. You're just like you're being opened up to this universe of music and musicians at the time that just seemed like, even though Klaus and Chris Franck and Tangerine Dream was maybe 5 or 6 years older than me, it felt like these were musical entities that had been around for eons. In terms of the mystery of that and the whole allure of this coming out of Europe and Germany and all the European countries. So when it was coming in, there was a great deal of magic around that. When it was, in the early days, I, just couldn't even imagine that each week, the kind of adventure you could go on with the vinyl coming in.
Yeah, and imagine that, for you opening your first record store, opening and playing, I don't know, early Tangerine Dream stuff. you thought to yourself, man, that's exactly what I meant to do. With my life, I really like that kind of music. And you're like a kid in a candy store, the Klaus Schulze, the Tangerine Dream, I don't know, Peter Baumann and Manuel Goslin and all the people
exactly.
I admire, so.
No, that's exactly it. And again, it was at a time to where when you were phasing out of the what we'll say, more traditional progressive music, which had its place. And, I was quite into Yes, as I was saying, but when I still remember at this moment when I pulled Time Wind out and played it for the first time, and it was like I was in a dark, it would, like, the metaphor would be you've been living in kind of a darker room, and when I put that on, all the lights went on. Everything was illuminated in my own consciousness and in my imagination for creativity. And that's the album that really, I always say, it always turned all the lights on for me. And I just felt at that moment so drawn to finding the instruments that would make this kind of music, and it had that same sort of feeling I was looking at the beginning of Close to the Edge, where it wasn't 3 minutes, it was 30 minutes long. And then you could, so at that point, I wrote Klaus Schulze a letter, and as a young guy enthusiastic about discovering his music, like I'm sure thousands of people, young folks did at that time. But he wrote me back and he asked exactly the right questions. It's, do you have an echo machine? ARP string ensemble, great choice. 2600, yes, awesome. Great. Whatever, you wouldn't say awesome then, but he would say great. Yeah. So it was like getting, the darshan with the master. He's like, yes, you're there and there. And so, I still have the letter from him that I received 48 years ago or something.
Wow.
So from that point, so the segue between the record store and then having a 2600, an ARP 2600, and an ARP string synthesizer, which again, that instrument, I said I could just play concerts for people sitting on the couch in my apartment, just playing chords on that. I love that sound through an echo machine. But at that time, the cost of that was outrageous. For a young guy who's working a job, basically I was working in a small factory building microwave antennas for communication. It's just again, you're making things as on a production line kind of deal. So when I heard that music, I had to find where do these instruments come from? Even at the time, those instruments would be like going out and digging for gold, and where does that come from? And then once you find them, they had the price of gold attached to them. They were so expensive, in the late 70s. So, and my parents were always emphasizing to me, if you want something, you go out and work for it, and then you'll get it through your own work. So they didn't have the money to support eventually they'd kick in here and there when they saw how hard or how much I was devoting to do this. But ultimately I went and secured a very high interest loan, 25% loan, and was able to buy $4 or $5 grand worth of electronic, tools, synthesizers, just exactly what I wanted at that time. And then it was validated by Klaus's letter, but between the gear and itself, it was about $8,000 investment for a guy who could, barely put gas in his car, So that was sort of what I always refer to as like the born again synthesizer fervor, where it just, nothing was going to get in. I had to have the tools, and I couldn't wait. I tried to go to a college that had a junior college that had electronic music courses, and the pace at which they were moving at and the things they were teaching, I just felt like I'm going to just die on the vine here if I stay in this school, in this class, trying to learn electronic music. I mean, it was moving along at a snail's pace, and my mind was just racing towards, I just have to get my hands on the instruments. And when I did, it just clicked. I felt like I already know intuitively how to do this. I instinctively felt drawn to the way you make sounds on synthesizer. And so that's where I taught myself the rudiments of music from using the synthesizers. So I'm fully self-taught. I do not read music, but I was gathering up theory books and studying and learning about the foundations of music from more of an academic perspective. But I was not. I just early on I knew I did not fit in an academic paradigm. I just couldn't operate in a classroom with that, all the things that happen where you have different levels of people that are more advanced or less advanced, but there's this kind of thing that restricts certain minds, I think, from growing when you have that kind of comparison going on. So I just knew as an only child, I'm easily entertained alone in my room. So if I have a room full of synthesizers and time, there it is. So that's the origin story right there of the whole deal.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, like, you were doing things at your own pace, right? So you could stay, all night long playing and learning stuff for 2 hours a day, right? So there was not going to school from 6 to 10, whatever, to learn what you were at a different level. And perhaps that's the only way to learn on your own.
Yeah, you get that 10,000 hour thing clocked in real quick,
Exactly, right. So at the time, Berlin always had been, Berlin School of Music, or perhaps the capital of the electronic music in the world. But at the same time, in Italy in the 70s, the beginning when Genesis did their first gigs there, there was a lot of progressive music, like PFM and Banco, and there were a lot of great music.
Sensations Fix. Sensations Fix.
Yep.
You remember those guys there?
Yeah. And so they were on one hand, a lot of, experimental, and then band trying to imitate Pink Floyd, but a lot of electronic, right? A lot of people can it. So it was, great times in music, So both coming from Italy and coming from Berlin in particular, right? So
and then you had that, just the seeds that were being planted around the world, but especially in Europe. And at that time, as an import, if you were absorbing all the imports that were coming in, like you say, there was all of this coming from France, from Italy, from Germany, of course, from the UK, and all of that continued to find its way over here and inspire a lot of the American composers and electronic musicians that I'm sure you're interviewing and have interviewed.
Yeah, correct. And also at the same time, a lot of people in the electronic music world, not just Tangerine Dream, but I don't know, bands like Bubble Boo, right? We're doing music for Werner Herzog movies. So
absolutely,
when you have whatever, a science fiction movie or a horror movie, they're always going to be, or suspense movie, always keyboard, and then, in the background to facilitate whatever the director want to do in a particular thing. So since the early day, music, electronic, right? Whether you're a consumer like myself or you a producer like yourself, they were,
and we were all listening in like the Suspiria soundtracks and that sort of thing, and all of that. It was just, you could be voracious collecting. I mean, you could have, like you are, like I know, and I was, and not so much vinyl now, but I still have thousands of CDs, and at that time, amazing record collection. I mean, that was how we learned and how we
absolutely.
There was this whole wave of inspiration that was happening on so many levels, and but again, the Klaus Schulze piece for me, it just hit such a nerve, and then those early Tangerine Dream albums, in particular, Phaedra, Rubicon, and Ricochet, those three albums.
Wow, those are classic, man. Yeah,
that's the triad right there. I mean, that's still holy ground. Those three albums right there for me, along with Time Wind and Mirage, Picture Music. Those were the ones that it's just like you could call it, if you're like the Old Testament. That's like where it's all at right there.
So you said letter to Klaus Schulze. Have you ever wrote to Edgar Froese at the time, or Vangelis, or one of those?
Actually, what was cool is I met Klaus when I was playing at a big concert in Netherlands. Eventually, I played in 1991 at Klimdag, which
Yeah.
was
Wow.
the biggest electronic festival at the time. There was 4,000 people there. I mean, Klaus came, and they had a huge vendors area. And again, 4,000 people would come to these each year, Klim Day. And Klaus came just, I mean, he came to experience it, and he knew I was playing, and he had heard of me by that point, and obviously I'd written him, whether he remembered that or not. But he sought out my booth, and we met and spoke and talked and just connected, and that was fantastic. And by that time, I had already worked with Michael Shreve, who he worked with, obviously, earlier on. And so that was like an obvious connection there between Klaus and I. Was working with Michael, and I had performed concerts with Michael and that sort of thing. So, and then eventually in Los Angeles, in the scene there that I was thriving in and building in LA at that point, I was playing hundreds of concerts in LA in the early 80s. Yeah. And one concert, Chris Franck came to my concert with his girlfriend, and it was in this beautiful garden in Venice Beach, right there in LA, classic Venice Beach scene. But it was an outdoor festival with Kevin Brahini and this guy called Francisco and his Cosmic Beam, and he had this 14-foot beam like Michael Stearns plays. You know what the beam is?
Yeah.
Strings on it. It's like a bass guitar that you could hear a half a mile away. So that was an afternoon concert. So Chris came and we met, and I just remember him just hanging out in this beautiful sunny afternoon, and he was moving between beers and iced tea or something, and so, or coffee, that's what it was, coffee and beers, hanging out with and watching my set. And then he actually came to my house the next day because I was scoring a video for a well-known video artist of the day, David M. Like it's the letter M, and he was he did Herbie Hancock's Future Shock cover. So he was a visual artist, and we were always looking for visual artists at the time. So Chris heard I was doing the soundtrack for this David M's video, and so he came over and wanted to see his work. So he paid a visit to my little apartment in Culver City there in Los Angeles near the beach. And again, that's like having the Dalai Lama come to your house when you're just starting out. It's like, wow. Oh my God, you sort of get that another one of those affirmations that you're on the right track.
Absolutely.
So Chris was absolutely very cool and just really kind and suggesting different thoughts about some gear to use and whatnot. And so eventually then I, in the same time period, because Chris and Edgar were in LA a lot doing film work, then there was this studio where they used to animate the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon shows and on Sunset Boulevard, but it was taken over by some visual animators that I worked with that were doing really state-of-the-art, really abstract visual material. And so they were in the old studios where you had Rocky out, this big cement figure, if you know that, those cartoons from back in the day with the Rocky and the Bullwinkle sort of thing. It was just very surreal is the point I'm trying to make. But I walk in, and then Edgar's there, and he's looking and reviewing their work. And Edgar was a different story from Chris, where Edgar, there was a quality of just, I was absolutely intimidated. I mean, he was friendly, but still really very intense and more stoic. And it's Edgar, I mean, what can you say, and he's a big guy, and I'm like 6'2" on a good day, but he seemed like he was about 8'9" or something, his presence was so big. So those were cool memories from that period. But through all that, in my time in LA, after I left San Diego and I jumped into the creative current of just playing and being immersed in electronic music 24/7, it hasn't let up till it's happening for 45 years now, just continuous straight through. So.
But then, I don't know, Astra Temple or Manuel Goshin, those people were the same people that I admire, especially Manuel Goshin. And they're great musician coming out of that age, man. So eventually I'm sorry? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, all the Astra, New Age of Earth, and Inventions for Electric Guitar, and Correlations. I mean, all that was those were
Paradise, man.
Those were the de facto like essentials. You had to have that in your vocabulary musically and as reference points. And the inspiration of that would feed you, but it would also direct you to an area like, well, that's been done now. I want to do something that of my own that's not
your music, your type of music,
that's
right?
inspired by that. So that's where structures came from at that point. Structures from silence. Yeah.
I will ask you about that. So eventually, you left the record store, you saved the money, you buy your equipment, you were at home like a nerd, learning everything your own. And then you say, well, I need to start putting my music out there. How difficult was to put the first vinyl out there, the first output that you end up creating?
Right. So the first thing I was recording onto cassette all the time, and that I would record live, everything I was doing onto cassettes there in this little downstairs bungalow apartment in San Diego County. And eventually that little record store I was working at, it brought in this magazine called Synapse Magazine, and that magazine was out of LA, and it was published by these electronic artists at the time who had a band called Mobius, electronic trio called Mobius, or a duo, or there was four guys. I mean, they switched out, but eventually, then this is not the European Mobius, as in Mobius and Rodelius. This is that group from LA that was Mobius.
Hans Rodelius is different from the Mobius.
Yeah, this was more of almost like Kraftwerk kind of new wave. Combining things. So these guys that had that electronic group, there was a trio, and they brought me in with my gear eventually, but they were all graduates from CalArts Studios. So they were studying with Morton Subotnick and Harold Budd, and they were a bit older than me, but they could see how completely possessed I was and to do electronic music. So they invited me to move up to LA, and they helped me get my start up there. And so from that point, then everything, started to fall into place. I was doing a lot of concerts with them, starting to record my own music, continuing on with cassette. And then eventually I created my first release, Now, and that was primarily recorded all with pieces from cassette. So at that time in LA, the word was out about myself and some other electronic artists that were playing out a lot. There was not a lot of electronic musicians doing non-academic music, i.e. meaning music that was more European or inspired by Klaus or Tangerine Dream and all the music we've been talking about. You could find a lot of academic, concerts which were really, really approaching from more of an intellectual, conceptual place, but the more visceral, driving sequencer kind of thing that I was doing that like early on in LA. So it would draw the attention, of a lot of people that way. So eventually there was a guy who worked at Chrysalis Records at the time that was, Jethro Tull's label and Pat Benatar and the pop music kind of stuff. But he's right there on Sunset Boulevard, but he was hearing my concerts. So he, in Venice Beach and around. So he's the guy that brought the idea of first producing and putting up the money, which was a great deal of money at that time to put out your first album. Yeah. So he helped me produce my album, which came out on vinyl. The first album was Traveler. And that had the influences of the European school, but I was very specific in that those pieces on Traveler would be, on Now was my first release, and he heard that on cassette, and then the next one we did was Traveler. But the big piece there was that I wanted to work in shorter time frames, not half an hour sidelong pieces like we were hearing from the Berlin School, and especially, and all the music that was 20. Well, at that time you could squeeze 30 minutes on the side of a vinyl if you obviously didn't cut the grooves too deep, but
that's right,
Time Wind was 30 minutes aside. So, but my feeling was I grew up in this completely different part of the world, and all the influences of Southern California, and also realizing I'm not I'm not wanting to draw a tracing paper around. I mean, I was inspired and deeply inspired and motivated and moved by the music from Europe, but I was really feeling like I wanted to create more of a journey that was varied, where you'd move through a lot of different landscapes, parallel with desert, mountains, ocean, canyons, all that sort of landscape as a metaphor journeys within a set of all these different pieces. So when you listen to Now, Traveler, Impetus, even those albums in particular had the sequential and it had the roots from Europe, but it was much more varied in terms of the moods and the feelings. Some pieces were really bright and real full of sunlight, and others were more atmospheric and darker, that would suggest where I would go later on with Magnificent Void or Mystic Chords or something. But, in the middle of all that, this whole other piece came through, which was Structures from Silence. I don't know if you want to speak to that now, or...
Yeah, that's a masterpiece, man. I tell you, I own electronic music, I don't know, at least 1,500 vinyls. Mostly have most vinyl nowadays, but I love it. That's a masterpiece, Stephen. I know you're a very humble guy and quiet guy, but I'll tell you, for a consumer point of view, and I listen to a lot of stuff, pop, jazz, rock, electronic, the Wendy Carlos, the Susan Ciani, and the Tangerine Dream, Peter Bauman, Klaus Schulze, all these people that was my probably top 50 albums. It's hard to decide which one is the best one, but it's a masterpiece. And you were very young. I mean, that's the thing, and the other thing that surprised me, that nowadays, kids go to that expensive school or Berkeley School of Music or this or that. You knew what you wanted to do early in life. You had very supporting parents. You bought equipment, on a 25% interest rate. You learn on your own. People don't understand. Back then, there wasn't no internet. There was no YouTube where you can look at videos. Now you go to YouTube to do a video to do everything, or to, water the plants. You can do a video on YouTube, and it wasn't a smartphone. You figure out your own. That's even more remarkable. How did that work? Cassette, writing a piece of paper. Okay, when I do this oscillator or sequencer, if I move this knob or this too much, whatever, you did everything on your own. And that album now is a masterpiece, Stephen.
Well, thank you for all of what you're sharing there. And
yeah.
There's no question that when I had the inspiration and the compulsion to do this music, that I was looked at by everybody around me, including my parents, outside of my mom, who's going to love her son, through it all. But I mean, people just said, what in the hell what is this? What are you even wasting what is this? There's no reference point, nothing. It was already, the European-based music coming in was already, you were kind of out on the edge of being a freak when you were listening to, a lot of that music.
Right.
Just, we're kind of on the outside, but that was even more fuel for me. Was I just have this feeling, and I know that this is something that I'm just so nourished by, and it felt so natural to me to create that way. It wasn't like, well, I'm going to become a painter of abstract Mark Rothko type paintings or something. I mean, I was drawn into that world, and yeah, absolutely. I mean, that we learn from the vinyls that you're speaking about, and then you're not like instantly now you get any synthesizer, you get it from wherever you're buying it from, and then you go online, and within a half an hour you've got everybody's mapped it all out for you, how to use it, and there's advantages of that, and I use it now, and for technical virtual manuals, and to save time having to dig deep to find out how to do one little function that's buried way under the hood somewhere. But that exploratory process of what Eno calls idiot glee, is you can learn things, and it's not about being an idiot, but it's the glee, but it's the joy, it's the freedom of discovery without the boundaries or without the traditional, like I said, going to a college to learn electronic music I could have been there 15 years before any of that happened. So there, something was very, very, very much highly, I would say, developed in me as an artist with sound that was beyond my years and beyond my knowledge as just a day-to-day young guy in Southern California. But there was like some kind of emotional, spiritual, crossroads that I was tapping into, and those instruments were giving me instant access to this place that I might not have ever found without taking the high interest loan or putting myself at great financial risk and or whatever. But having that courage, basically, there's the courage to really create is what I always want to inspire people to do on your own terms. And that's what, so much of my music, my music's born from that spirit of just like this kind of pioneering spirit of going off and just going for it. And then what comes back is what you find when you're out there exploring right here in my time house that I'm talking to you from. So, and then you would be validated along the way with certain albums that would hit a certain sweet spot for people. Now was already my first cassette release, hit a lot of nerves and people in a good way. And then Traveler, the same. But then soon, I was like within 6 years, then Structures came through. And Structures really came through in a moment where when you hear the title track, the time that it takes to hear that piece is how long it took to create that piece. It was just made as you hear it. It was recorded on the Oberheim, and I had a digital sequencer that was recording what I was playing. And once I played that piece, I just hit stop and play, and then it played everything right back, but it was still digital. It wasn't recorded to tape. So then I could live with it and fine tune the tempo and do very subtle changes of the filter and changing qualities of the sound. And so I lived with it for a couple of months, and then I went into a nice studio, but it was all still live, and it was all what the original first pass of Structures is what we recorded onto a high-end reel-to-reel. And that became that piece. And then Reflection and Suspension, that was recorded onto a Nakamichi, a very high-end, but it was still a cassette. It was a metal cassette master is what that piece was. For Reflections and Suspension, the first track on Structures. So this is the sort of the genealogy of that album. And then Quiet Friend was my first recording on a Tascam 4-track. So I was actually, I'm able to record the first part down and come back and compose and layer it in parts because I was so used to recording live. But all those pieces were recorded between, I'd say, 1982 and 83 over the course of about a year. But when recording them, I was not thinking of, I'm making an album here. I set out to make an album, Structures from Silence. It was nothing to do with that. It was all to do with being this young, on the edge, living guy, hardly able to afford food, living in Los Angeles, crazy, absolutely incredibly crazy city to live in, at that time. Now is, I'm sure, more than ever. But at night, it would get really calm and really deeply still and quiet. And I lived about 8 miles inland from the ocean. So that feeling again of desert, sanctuary, space, the quality of tone, silence between the notes, all of that was really coming back. It was available to me. So it was like I was able to take all of those years of the desert and breathe it into this kind of music that would then nourish me and give me a sense of safety and support and comfort in the middle of this crazy world of LA. So it was really all about creating music just for me and for my well-being and for my mental health and my stability, to create a sanctuary in a way that it's doing still 40 years later now for people, so it's just that there was nothing grandiose about it. It was like I'm creating it out of an absolute incredible need to be immersed in that space.
Absolutely. And then so you put the record out there, and then how long did it take before people start noticing or being played on the radio? At the time, there were many syndicated programs, radio station like Hard Space, and I think that record came to attention of Stephen Hill, if I remember correctly, and they start playing. Who is this kid? This music is very, very good, right? So so people start calling you, and well, not calling you, but at the time we didn't have cell phone, but we got landline. So people start approaching you. Hey, you want to play this live, or who is this kid with this great music? We're coming out of nowhere in Los Angeles.
That's absolutely perceptive, and it's all part of the great stories around that time. But because I lived in this Culver City area, again, which was just inland from Venice Beach in West LA, West Los Angeles, a lot of artists, cutting edge, creative stuff happening everywhere, dance, music, jazz, all kinds of ambient, emerging ambient electronic, but that was a little more finely tuned and sparse. But as destiny or fate would have it, Michael Stearns lived about 1.5 miles from where I was living.
Wow.
So we somehow met up through the community there in Los Angeles at the time. There was a famous writer who used to be the guitar player for Tim Buckley, and that was Lee Underwood. And Lee Underwood became a really well-known writer for Downbeat magazine, and he was absolutely at the front edge of that whole sound in LA at that time with Tim Buckley, whose son was Jeff Buckley later on.
Yep.
And that, I'm sure. So, but Lee became a major proponent and absolute, enthusiast for this music. So he was starting to write about it as this emerging new genre, and he was starting to do a radio show. And I think I might have met Michael through Lee Underwood. But in any case, so I recorded the music, as I had mentioned, in my little tiny bungalow studio in Culver City. And then at a certain point, I started to learn about what you need to do to release an album on a cassette, which you need to master it, fine tune it a bit. So Lee introduced me to Michael. I think that's the way it went. But in any case, I'm over at Michael's with, almost like walking over there to his place. We live so close to each other. So he helped me out with one of the tracks and putting some eventide spatialization on it, helping me with that. The next thing I know, I meet up with Kevin Brahini, and he's working at another studio. And so I managed to do some more fine tuning on the master recording. And at that point, I had the 3 tracks, and I said, well, these feel like they belong together. And then the feeling of Structures from Silence, the title came in, which is essential when that title for that music was born from me listening to it for 4 months straight with hardly any other music coming in. It's just, this is what it is. It's what I'm about at that time. So anyway, I got the master, found out the local cassette duplicating company and sent that material to him, and I paid a woman I knew to do the cover, and just basically produced the whole thing and did like 300 or 400 cassettes. And at that point, again, this is not Bandcamp. This is not the internet. This is not anything. This is like putting an ad in Option magazine for your CD. I mean, not CD, but for your cassette or your vinyl. And then you get a letter in your PO box. And then about 4 weeks later, the whole circle is complete. You get the order, you send it off, or you get the check and all that sort of thing. So eventually the whole road to Stephen Hill, though, the long story short is that he and Michael were already friends through Michael's music being played on Hearts of Space. So when Michael heard my music, he mentioned it to Stephen Hill. You need to hear Steve's music and this music that he's releasing. So at that point, it was on a cassette. So I remember that Stephen was in Los Angeles visiting Michael, and I get probably a telephone call, or that's probably, I had the old landline, and we arranged, and he came by my little studio, and I still remember that whole thing like it happened yesterday. He's just there by himself, and tiny little apartment. I mean, it was not an apartment. It was a single, looked like a little gingerbread house, and it was right near the MGM film lot, and that's where all the MGM workers from the classic films from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer would work, the grips and the guys developing the film. So it had this whole vibe of being in that kind of world as well, this real creative world. So Stephen rolls up and sits down in my living room, and he still talks about when I offer him a glass of water. That's what we were serving up at that point. And he's sitting on a tiny little chair, and he had heard the music by that point. So we were just getting to know each other. And then he's the guy that then at that point introduced me to Ethan Edgecombe at Fortuna Records. And so we went from pretty quickly from me putting it out on cassette to Ethan and I meeting up. And Ethan was in Northern California in the Bay Area and had already put out some vinyl from some of the new age artists at that time in the Bay Area. And so very quickly we struck up a deal, and then Ethan put out Structures from Silence on vinyl. And then that's where it all started at that point, was that. And then that was around the same time as the producer from Chrysalis Records put out the Traveler album. That was the pieces we were speaking earlier about, the shorter pieces, but nothing like Structures at all. It was leading in another direction, but Structures was born kind of in the middle of that whole period where I was just exploding in all these different directions. But again, Structures was the piece that was my home. That was my deep, quiet core that I would always return to almost every day, playing that kind of thing. So Ethan really responded to that, and soon after that, I kept recording in that mode, and that's where the Quiet Music trilogy came from, right at that same time. So that was a long-winded answer there, but
it's good to listen to hear the kind of stuff. So so the vinyl is out, people are more receptive. Your music is playing in some radio programs, and it was mastered and from a cassette. Then I suppose that led to more concert, right? And then any kind of record label approach you, hey, Will, we like this. What else do you have?
Right,
what
so
we like to play? That I suppose that record was the before and after of Steve Roach life, I suppose, right? Because
when I moved to LA, I mean, I hit the ground playing live right off the front. I mean, and as soon as I moved there in 1980, 81, I was doing concerts all over West LA and Hollywood.
Yeah.
And really, before I even had any music out, I was just out, putting sets together and playing in lofts and different settings like that. So, but certainly, the Fortuna was, to me, that was getting a record deal with a new age label, which at that time I really didn't have any attachment to whether it was new age or whatever age. It was a guy putting out my music on vinyl, and he was also putting out music that was relevant to what I was doing. So I knew he was also marketing to the right audiences, for meditation and the emerging audiences that would then embrace what was in America. It wasn't space music so much as new age, as a genre, which that's a whole other story, but I work in such a wide range. But Structures just was Structures. It's just music that lives in its own world and in its own time and space and place. So yeah, that just set everything again at another level of everything was set in motion. And then the other albums that I was working on, Western Spaces, were all created within a 3 or 4 year period. Traveler, Structures, Quiet Music, Western Spaces, Impetus, Desert Solitaire, that whole progression of albums all up through the 80s, all building up to Dreamtime.